At 72, I sat through my wife's memorial supper while my stepdaughter sold the inn I still owned for $8.6 million before the coffee course. She did it from the center of my own ballroom beneath the chandeliers I had polished for 31 Christmas galas, while the town orchestra played soft strings and 2 waiters I had never hired guarded the study door like they were protecting a head of state. Before the story goes any further, take one quick second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. I always like knowing how far a story can travel before the truth comes home. Stay with me, because what happened inside that ballroom was only the first crack in a much larger lie. I had agreed to nothing. 3 hours earlier, Celia had stood in my dressing room with a sympathetic face and a silver tray, telling me the doctor wanted me to take something for my nerves before guests arrived. I poured the little paper cup into the fern by the window the moment she left. By sunset, I understood why she wanted me soft. Her husband had already arranged the bridge financing. The developer was already in the building. And the condolence cards on the entry table were covering the first layer of a theft large enough to bury an old hotel, a marriage, and a whole respectable family name in one evening. My name is Harold March. For most of my adult life I ran Tidewell House on the Georgia coast, an old cedar-sided inn with wide porches, salt silver railings, a ballroom that looked out over the marsh, and enough history tucked into its walls to make city people cry after one glass of wine and a walk through the rose path at dusk. When I married Eleanor March 33 years ago, Tidewell was already worn but proud. She had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from hers. The place survived hurricanes, bad management, an electrical fire, and one spectacular cousin who nearly lost half the property in the late 70s because he thought a shrimp boat partnership was a faster path to dignity than honest labor. By the time I came into the picture, Eleanor had the bones of the business and I had the discipline. She understood charm. I understood systems. She could make donors, mayors, widows, brides, and pastors all feel like the evening had been arranged especially for them. I knew how to make sure the flowers were paid for, the silver was polished, the pastry cream set properly, the linens matched, the invoices went out, and the rooms turned over without drama. It was a good marriage. Not a perfect one. I am too old to insult the dead with fairy tales. Eleanor could be vain and sentimental. She hated saying no to beautiful chaos, which is another way of saying she often volunteered me for work I had not agreed to do. She loved speeches. I loved ledgers. She believed every room could be softened with the right music. I believed most crises could be prevented with clear instructions and the right key kept by the right person. Between the two of us, the place flourished. We hosted weddings, reunions, military retirements, garden luncheons, church fundraisers, and the kind of memorials where people arrive broken and leave believing the dead were properly loved. If you do that work long enough, you learn that grief has a smell. It is lilies, starch, old perfume, cold coffee, and the skin of people who have not slept enough. Eleanor had one child from her first marriage. Celia. She was 11 when I met her, all sharp elbows, expensive manners, and watchful eyes that missed very little. Her mother, Miriam, had died of breast cancer 3 years earlier. Eleanor was drowning in guilt and tenderness by then. Anyone could see it. Celia understood it before most adults would have. She learned very young that sadness can buy permission, and permission can be turned into influence if you smile correctly while you collect it. That sentence sounds cruel. I know. It also happens to be true. I tried with her. People love to imagine second spouses as either saints or thieves. I was neither. I was a man in my late 30s who had fallen in love with a widow and understood from the start that I would spend years being measured against a ghost. I never touched Miriam's jewelry. I never boxed up her books. I kept her blue willow china in the dining room cupboard because Celia liked seeing it there during holidays. I let the girl keep the larger upstairs room because it looked over the marsh and made her feel important. I drove her to ballet, orthodontist appointments, debate tournaments, youth retreats, and 3 separate colleges she later decided were not right for her. When she was 26 and failed out of a non-profit fellowship in Boston after spending more time shopping than working, I did not say what I thought. When she came home crying after a terrible engagement to a man with wonderful hair and no visible soul, I put her in the East Room and brought her tea. I never once used the phrase "your mother would have done this differently," even though I sometimes wanted to. I believed decency would accumulate. I believed steadiness counted. It does, just not always in the way you expect. Grant Holloway entered our orbit when Celia was 39. He arrived in a navy blazer with expensive teeth, a development portfolio, and the kind of confidence that does not come from intelligence so much as the repeated discovery that other people are easier to move than furniture. He was tall, handsome in the polished way magazines like, and careful with older people. He called me Mr. March for almost a year, which Eleanor thought showed respect. I recognized it for what it was. Men who mean respect usually learn your name. Men who mean strategy preserve distance until they know what language opens the right doors. Grant worked in commercial acquisitions. Retail centers, mixed-use conversions, waterfront parcels, old properties with sentimental owners and valuable zoning histories. He could speak lovingly about preservation for exactly as long as it took to secure a meeting with a town council. Then, once the votes aligned, he could flatten a century of memory into parking, glass, and lease projections without spilling a drop of his bourbon. Eleanor admired that ruthlessness more than she should have. She used to call Grant a closer. As if closing were a virtue all by itself and not a talent that depends entirely on what one is willing to crush to get the document signed. For years, Celia hovered at the edge of Tidewell House without committing to it. She liked introducing the inn to men as if she owned it. She liked posting photographs from the ballroom and the Rose Path and writing captions about heritage and legacy and stewardship. She liked the idea of the place far more than the labor. The weathered siding, the old guest registers, the antique sideboards, the silver coffee urns, the stories. But when the septic line backed up after a storm, she vanished. When the florist missed a delivery and the bridal party was crying by noon, she vanished. When a cook quit on Christmas Eve and we plated dinner for 60 with 2 apprentices, she vanished. Celia enjoyed inheritance as an identity, not responsibility as a habit. Eleanor got sick 2 years before she died. It started with breathlessness, then a bypass, then a better stretch that made everyone hopeful, then the quieter decline that comes when people start saying the word stable because they are afraid to say the other things they mean. She was never bedridden for long. That almost made it worse. She could still walk the porch with me at sunset. She could still charm guests if she sat down often enough and timed his pills correctly. He could still tell a story at dinner that made a whole room forget he needed help standing. But the arithmetic of the body had changed. That is the only way I know to describe it. Everything cost more than it used to. Stairs. Salt. Excitement. Bad news. He knew it. So did I. When people are dying slowly, families begin arranging themselves around future money even before they know they are doing it. Some do it in terrified private thoughts and hate themselves for it. Some do it quietly with practical questions about taxes, repairs, insurance, and who knows where the documents are. Some do it with such grace you almost mistake them for holy. Then there are the others. The ones who begin speaking about continuity and stewardship and hard decisions while the sick person is still alive enough to hear the floorboards outside the bedroom door. Celia became one of those. She started visiting more often once Eleanor's cardiologist stopped promising miracles. At first it was flattering. She brought soups from restaurants she wanted me to believe she had made herself. She replaced the lilies in the parlor before they browned. She rearranged pillows. She made little sighing sounds of concern when Eleanor dozed in her chair and asked me whether I was sleeping enough. Grant arrived on weekends with tool belts he never used and financial advice nobody had requested. He began asking what our occupancy looked like outside wedding season. He asked whether we had ever considered monetizing the south field beyond the herb garden. He asked whether Eleanor had updated the trust recently and whether I found the property taxes oppressive. The first time he used the phrase underperforming land about the marsh-side parcel, I set down my fork so slowly even Eleanor looked up. The south field was where her mother used to put Easter tables when the weather cooperated. Underperforming land, apparently. Eleanor died on a Tuesday just after dawn, 3 weeks before the spring founders weekend we had spent months preparing for. She did not die dramatically. No last-minute revelation. No whispered treasure map. No sudden clarity after long fog. She had a bad night, then a short gentle morning, then a final small squeeze of my fingers that might have been goodbye or might simply have been discomfort. I was there. That matters to me more than it will matter to anyone else. He did not die alone. He died in the room overlooking the marsh with the windows cracked because he always hated sealed air. The first 48 hours after a death are when ambitious people move fastest, because grief creates administrative weather. Papers travel while widows stare at closets. Keys change hands while flowers arrive. Catering gets adjusted. Guest lists shift. Rooms fill. Voices lower. Decisions appear pre-made. I knew this. I had spent 30 years hosting memorials for other families. I just had the arrogance to believe my own would not use the fog against me. Celia proposed the memorial supper the day after the funeral home took Eleanor's body. Not a luncheon, she said, not a dreary visitation, something befitting her legacy. The town loved her. The preservation board loved her. The donors loved her. The chef from Savannah who had done that magazine event last autumn would come if we asked. She spoke in the language of tribute, which is the most expensive dialect of grief. I was too tired to fight every sentence. Grant said quietly that a beautiful event would reassure vendors and community partners that Tidewell remained stable. He said it would keep rumors down and confidence up. That phrase should have stopped me cold. Confidence up. Not comfort. Not remembrance. Confidence. I let them arrange it. There is the beginning of my shame. 3 days later, strange things started happening in my own house. Not dramatic things. That is how serious betrayal prefers to enter. My office desk was left half an inch open when I always close it flush. The brass box that holds our older vendor contracts had been turned so the latch faced outward instead of inward. A county plat map I kept rolled in the umbrella stand by the study disappeared and then reappeared behind the piano. The good wine from the founder's cellar, bottles Eleanor and I reserved for major anniversaries or quiet winter Saturdays, began leaving one by one. The florist invoice for the memorial tripled between morning and evening without any additional arrangements appearing on the property. Mateo, my pastry chef, asked why I wanted extra dessert forks for a private signing in the study after the memorial supper. I told him I had ordered no such thing. He went pale and said perhaps he had misunderstood the temporary events coordinator Celia brought in from Atlanta. Temporary events coordinator. At my inn. Then June Bell, my head housekeeper of 19 years and a woman with more sense in her left eyebrow than most people have in their full inheritance, asked me in the linen room whether the doctor had really told me to take those little evening cups Celia was bringing. Why do you ask? I said. Because you are slower after them, she replied. Not sick slower. Pushed under water slower. I stood still a long moment after that. June had watched me move through hurricane cleanup, boiler failures, and 2 ruptured wedding cakes without once confusing fatigue for confusion. If she said I was not myself, she meant it. That night I poured the paper cup into a potted fern and slept clearer than I had since Eleanor died. By the evening of the memorial, my mind was sharp enough to notice everything. The supper began at 6:30. We had 206 guests, which was 40 more than I approved. The entry hall held lilies, white roses, and low mercury candles. Eleanor's framed photographs were staged across the grand piano as if a magazine editor had arranged grief by height. I wore a black suit, my grandfather's cufflinks, and the watch Eleanor bought me for our 20th anniversary after a flood season so bad we thought we might lose the East Wing. Celia wore cream, which offended me immediately and then offended me more once I realized she had chosen it because soft colors photograph as benevolence under ballroom light. Grant moved through the room touching elbows, lowering his head at appropriate intervals, guiding people toward the Marsh windows and the donation table he claimed supported Eleanor's New Legacy initiative. New Legacy initiative. Eleanor had been dead less than a week. I stayed upstairs until just before the main course because I wanted to see whether they would truly proceed without me if they believed I had taken the sedating cup. They did. That was useful. Then I came down the back stair, crossed through the service corridor, and entered the ballroom from the south doors just as the string quartet shifted into a slower piece and Celia tapped a spoon against her champagne glass. Nothing reveals a room like applause prepared for the wrong speech. She smiled when she saw me. Only for half a second did her face lose control. Then she recovered and widened the smile, the way good society women do when a plan must be revised while the donors are already seated. There she is, she said into the microphone. Harold was resting, but I knew she would never want to miss this. A few people turned kindly. A few turned curiously. Grant's hand moved once toward his jacket pocket, then away. Celia began with Eleanor. She was good at that. She always had been. She spoke of tides, heritage, stewardship, cedar smoke from winter fireplaces, children on the lawn at Easter, Eleanor teaching local boys to tie proper bow ties before Founders' Dinner, Eleanor carrying extra umbrellas to the church ladies during summer storms. Half of it was true. That is another important thing about dangerous people. They build their lies out of memory because memory lowers defenses. Then she changed the room. In honor of my mother, she said, and with Harold's blessing, we have decided not merely to preserve Tidewell House, but to transform it. Tonight we begin the next chapter. We are partnering with Holloway Meridian Development and the March Legacy Foundation to ensure Eleanor's vision lives on in a way worthy of this extraordinary property. A screen lit behind her. A rendering appeared. Not of my inn. Of a polished compound of glass cottages, event lawns, luxury retail at the road front, and something labeled the March Coastal Heritage Center in pale gold script across a new entry wall built where Eleanor's mother's camellias had stood for 80 years. There are moments when the body understands treachery before language catches up. Mine did. My spine went cold and my mouth tasted metallic. I heard someone at table 12 whisper beautiful in the same delighted tone brides use when they first see fireworks. Grant stepped to the side of the screen with a pointer and began thanking the acquisition team, our financing partners, the council members who had quietly supported the rezoning concept, and the generous friends who had already pledged almost $900,000 to launch Eleanor's vision. Our financing partners. Quietly supported. Already pledged. He said it all while Eleanor's memorial candles were still burning. Then he looked toward me and delivered the line he thought would trap me. Harold has been courageous enough to understand that legacy is not sentiment. Legacy is action. The room applauded. I did not. I moved toward the front table slowly, not because I was weak, but because speed rewards the wrong people in moments like that. When you rush, the room calls you emotional. When you arrive carefully, the room must watch. I reached my chair. I sat down. I folded my napkin once. Then the town banker, Walter Finn, a man who had financed half the fishing fleet and enough small businesses to mistake himself for Providence, bent down and murmured beside my shoulder, "We can slip into the study after dessert, Harold. Page 4 only needs your initials. The bridge piece is already lined up." That was how I learned the scale. They were not testing reaction. They were executing sequence. I looked at Walter, then at Celia, then at Grant. Grant gave me a tiny almost imperceptible nod, as if we were professionals about to close a dull but necessary matter after the guests finished coffee. So I gave them my line. I did not stand. I did not shout. I simply looked up at Celia, then across the room at her husband, and said, loud enough for the nearest 5 tables to hear, sell it if you like, but first prove you own the ground under the ballroom. The room went thin. Grant smiled too quickly. Celia let out a soft laugh that sounded like crystal tapping crystal. Eleanor always said I was too romantic about the land, Harold, she replied. We will talk privately in a moment. I smiled back with every bit as much warmth. No, darling, I said. Private is how thieves prefer paperwork. That was the moment control shifted. Not publicly, not completely, but visibly enough that the right people smelled it. The quartet stumbled half a beat. Walter straightened. One of the temporary waiters glanced toward the study door. June, from across the room near the coffee station, looked directly at me and lowered her chin once. We were underway. What followed that sentence was not a scene in the theatrical sense. No one dropped a glass. No one fainted. Good society almost never gives you the satisfaction of open collapse. It gives you smiles with exposed enamel, firmer grips on stems, men adjusting jackets, women turning their shoulders to improve sightlines while pretending not to stare. The mayor's wife asked Mateo for more butter she did not need. A donor from Jacksonville laughed too loudly at nothing. Celia finished the speech. Of course she did. She thanked everyone for their generosity, invited them to the Rose Veranda for coffee and a private viewing of the concept renderings, then came straight to my table with Grant at her shoulder like a well-dressed shadow. Harold, she said, every vowel wrapped in satin, perhaps we should step into Eleanor's study before anyone misreads your grief. I rose. Not because she directed me to, but because the study was where answers were. Grant reached for my elbow. I let him almost touch my sleeve before turning just enough that he had to withdraw without making a spectacle. Small humiliations matter. Especially for men who think access is their native right. The study sat off the back corridor beyond the library, a room of dark paneling, old maps, ship prints, tax stamps, family ledgers, and the mahogany desk Eleanor's grandfather bought from a Savannah banker during the Depression. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar, paper, and brandy. It had always been the room where marches made themselves feel permanent. That night it held a fold-out tray of signing pens, a chrome carafe of coffee, 3 thick document stacks clipped in blue, and 2 low floral arrangements so expensive they practically confessed. Grant closed the door behind us. Celia did not sit. She stood by the desk with one hand on the back of Eleanor's leather chair, claiming the room before I could. I took the smaller side chair deliberately and set my leather folder on my lap. You embarrassed yourself, Grant said first. Men like him often lead with discipline when rattled, as if the right tone can still restore authority. No, I said. I interrupted a sale. Celia exhaled through her nose. Harold, you are exhausted. Everyone can see that. We wanted tonight to be dignified. Then why is there a developer in my ballroom? She looked at Grant. Grant looked at the blue-clipped packets. The choreography between them was polished enough to make me wonder how long they had rehearsed this room. Long enough, as it turned out. Grant stepped closer to the desk and spread the documents as if he were offering investment options to a client too emotional to understand her own advantage. This is not theft, he said. This is rescue. He pointed to the first packet. Preliminary acquisition agreement. The second. Bridge financing to cover urgent obligations, donor commitments, tax exposure, deferred maintenance, and transition costs. The third. Formation documents for the March Legacy Foundation. He spoke in measured tones about stewardship, restructuring, community benefit, brand continuity, and the need to act while interest remained high after Eleanor's passing. I asked him what urgent obligations meant. He answered too quickly. Liquidity events. That is not an obligation, I said. That is a phrase men use when they are trying to hide a fire with nicer wallpaper. Celia cut in, sharper now. The inn is cash poor and land rich. You know that. Do I? Yes, she said. Weddings down after hurricane season, maintenance up, insurance rising, Eleanor's medical bills, deferred shoreline reinforcement, vendor arrears, payroll strain. Shall I continue? Continue until you tell the truth. She smiled then. It was a bad sign. Celia only smiled like that when she believed she finally had the leverage to stop performing love. Fine, she said. The truth is that Tidewell has been run sentimentally for years. Beautifully, but sentimentally. You refused revenue opportunities. You protected dead gardens and useless field lines. You underpriced the founder's suite because your favorite widows liked it. You let staff stay who should have been phased out. You spent money restoring details nobody under 50 notices. We found a way to make this place matter again. Matter again. That stung, though I did not let it show. Tidewell had paid its taxes, paid its staff, survived storms, and held half the town through births, funerals, marriages, and heartbreaks longer than Celia had known how to pronounce endowment. But to people like Celia and Grant, value only counts once it shines in a prospectus. I asked the amount. $8.6 million for the primary parcel, Grant said, plus performance incentives tied to commercial leases and events revenue after transition. Primary parcel, I repeated. Which parcel exactly? He slid over a survey map. There it was. Main house, guest cottages, ballroom, Rose Path, South Field, carriage barn, shoreline path, and the old packing shed out by the road. Nearly everything Eleanor and I touched in our adult lives wrapped in color-coded ambition. You forgot the marsh strip, I said. He said it was excluded from Phase 1. Phase 1, I repeated. He smiled that same cool professional smile he used when he thought numbers would intimidate the sentimental. The marsh strip becomes relevant after rezoning certainty. There it was again. Quietly supported by counsel. Already in motion. Already assumed. I asked how they planned to bridge anything against title they did not hold. Celia looked at me with flat patience. Through my mother's authority and your cooperation, she said. Which is what we expected until you decided to make a scene in front of donors. My cooperation. Grant stepped in before I could answer. You only need to do 3 things tonight. Initial page 4 on the acquisition packet, sign the foundation consent, and execute a temporary management power so we can stabilize operations while the transfer completes. That is the elegant version. If you prefer, tomorrow morning can be uglier. He said it casually, almost kindly. I asked what ugly meant. Celia walked to the drinks cabinet and poured herself water with the steadiness of a woman about to describe weather. We have $900,000 in pledges tied to tonight's rollout, she said. $240,000 already moved into foundation holding accounts. Deposits with vendors. Concept work. Lobbying fees. Preliminary financing fees. If you refuse now, the donors will ask why. The bank will ask why. The foundation board will ask why. And because everything has been presented under the assumption of your support, we will have to explain that your behavior has become unreliable since Eleanor's death. There it was. Not dementia. Not conservatorship. Something cleaner and more poisonous. Grief incompetence. Enough to isolate me socially, maybe enough to stall banks and frighten vendors, but dressed as concern instead of institutional violence. Grant opened a folder from inside his jacket and placed several printed emails beside the acquisition packet. I recognized my name in the header lines. I did not recognize the accounts. You have been emotional in correspondence, he said. Sometimes contradictory. Vendors have noticed. Donors have noticed. The board has concerns. Walter at the bank has concerns. If we must protect the inn from erratic leadership during transition, we can. I read one of the emails. It described me as overwhelmed, forgetful, prone to isolation, resistant to basic financial realities, and possibly incapable of handling public decision-making after a severe bereavement event. It was written in Celia's style but sent from an events address built to look internal. Another came from Grant to a donor couple in Atlanta, describing me as fragile but well-loved, and explaining that my private blessing for the sale might not survive the stress of public details. One more, sent to a board member I had never approved, spoke of preserving Eleanor's vision before Harold retreats into nostalgia and sentimentality. I looked up at them both. You built the room before inviting me into it. Grant actually had the nerve to shrug. That is what competent people do, he said. No, I replied. Competent people ask owners before selling their roofs. That was when Celia stopped pretending the discussion could end in persuasion. Listen to me carefully, she said. My father is gone. The inn cannot continue as your private shrine. We have investors, donor expectations, and political momentum. The longer you delay, the more expensive this becomes. Sign tonight and you keep the East Cottage, a lifetime stipend, and your title for ceremonial purposes. Refuse and we let the town decide whether you are sabotaging Eleanor's final legacy out of grief and selfishness. Lifetime stipend. Ceremonial title. I almost smiled. They had already reduced me to a ribbon cutter on my own land. I asked when Eleanor supposedly approved this vision. Celia answered without hesitation. Over the winter. In pieces. I asked where. At home. On the porch. In the study. During calls with Grant. In meetings you did not attend because you were handling flowers or room blocks or whatever detail absorbed you that week. Grant handed me a document with Eleanor's signature on a board consent page. That is not his witness pattern, I said immediately. Grant's expression flickered. Eleanor always angled down on the final H in March when she signed formal papers after medication. That line rises. And she never used blue ink after 2012 because it smeared under her left hand. Celia said grief was making me obsessive. Perhaps, I said. Or perhaps 30 years of watching your mother sign things taught me how my own husband's hand behaved when someone was not trying to borrow authority from the dead. Grant closed the packet slowly. I could almost hear his calculations rearranging. Then he changed tactics. Do you know what the memorial cost, Harold? I told him I knew what it should have cost. He leaned in slightly. $92,000 before tonight's donations, he said. Because excellence is not cheap. Nor is silence, nor goodwill, nor repair once word gets out that the widower of Tidewell House sabotaged the foundation launched in his wife's memory. We went out on a limb to protect the image of this place. If we fall, we do not fall alone. That sentence revealed more than he intended. Protect the image. Not the inn. Not me. Not Eleanor. The image. I asked what company handled the floral and lighting overages. He named Bellwether Heritage Solutions. I had never heard of them. I asked who sat on the foundation board. He named Celia, himself, Walter Finn, an Atlanta philanthropist called Moira Spence, and a councilman who had tried for years to run chain retail off the road frontage and had never forgiven me for laughing him off my porch. I asked to see the holding account statements. Celia actually laughed. Harold, this is not an audit. No, darling, I said. This is where you decide whether I leave this room angry or merely disappointed. Grant glanced at his watch. We do not have the luxury of your process tonight. I stood. That surprised them. They had expected me to sit there aging into surrender while they placed the correct pen in the correct widower's fingers. What you do have, I said, is until midnight. After that, any paper using my name, Eleanor's name, Tidewell's operating accounts, or foundation pledges attached to this stunt becomes evidence in a dispute you are not equipped to survive. If you want to speak of rescue, begin by telling your guests the sale was announced prematurely. If you want to speak of legacy, remove the developer from my ballroom before he finishes my wife's bourbon. If you want to speak of Eleanor's wishes, find me the original trust binder and the shoreline plat map you moved out of my study this afternoon. Celia's face hardened. You think you can bluff your way through this because people like you? No, I said. I think I can outlast you because this house knows my footsteps and you still need cue cards. I opened the study door before either of them could answer. Grant caught up with me in the corridor and said quietly, if you turn this into war, we will make the donors believe you stole from your own memorial fund. I did not stop walking. You already stole from it, I said. The only question left is how clumsy you become once the room is lit properly. The veranda had filled by then. Donors clustered near the renderings. The developer, Simon Vale, was charming, a preservation columnist who had never once spent an afternoon in the heat replacing plumbing seals and therefore found demolition far easier to romanticize if it arrived with the word heritage in front of it. Walter Finn had cornered 2 investors near the orchid display. I moved among them without making another speech. People in moneyed rooms expect the widower either to collapse or forgive. They never know what to do with the widower who begins asking efficient questions. How lovely, I said to Moira Spence, touching the edge of a rendering board. Who owns Bellwether Heritage Solutions? She blinked and said she thought Grant's team had engaged them. I asked whether her pledge went to the foundation or directly through the transition account. She said, what transition account? Useful. At the bar I asked Simon Vale whether his Phase 1 assumed live event operations during construction or a full seasonal closure. He answered automatically, then stopped when he realized I had not consented to the premise of his answer. Also useful. I found Walter by the veranda rail and asked him, in a tone no louder than whether his bridge people had seen my original title packet or only Grant's compiled survey extracts. He said compiled survey extracts. Very useful. By 9:30, the first small cracks were visible. Not enough to break the night. Enough to redirect my next move. I went up the service stair to the old linen loft where June kept retired tablecloths and storm candles. She was there with Matteo, both waiting without saying so. Matteo handed me a cup of coffee. June shut the door. They are using room 7 as an office, June said. The Atlanta woman. The temporary one. How temporary? She arrived 4 days ago with 2 locking cases and a portable scanner. She asked for payroll files, old board minutes, and the catering seals. I told her the seals were in your office. She said she already knew that. She has copied half the back room. Matteo added, and someone used Eleanor's dessert stamps on pledge cards. The gold wax ones from Founder's Dinner. I know because I keep them boxed by season. I asked whether either of them had seen Bellwether invoices. June nodded. In the laundry pass-through bin. Looked like flowers on the top pages. Looked like legal printing charges below. I asked where the old trust binder might be. Both of them looked unhappy. Then June said, the little black one with the brass corners. Yes. Celia carried it out to the carriage office Tuesday morning. Said Walter needed a look at entity history. I asked whether you knew. She said you were resting. There is a kind of silence that enters only when betrayal finally becomes administrative. That was the silence in that loft. Not heartbreak. Documentation. I told June to bring me every Bellwether invoice she could locate and not let the temporary coordinator remove another box from the property. I told Matteo to hold all dessert service to the ballroom for 20 minutes longer than planned. He did not ask why. Good staff learn the tone of necessary disobedience. Then I took Eleanor's spare master from the old storm key rack behind the linens and went looking for room 7. Tidewell House has 6 guest corridors and 42 rooms. I know every hinge sound, every window swell, every spot where the floorboards complain in rain season. Room 7 sat at the end of the east hall overlooking the service yard, a perfectly decent room nobody glamorous ever requests because it lacks a marsh view and the morning light comes in harsh. The door was locked. Eleanor's master opened it on the second turn. Inside I found a portable printer, 2 scanning lamps, a wall covered in color-coded sticky notes, my old board letterhead, copied signatures, donor grids, vendor lists, and 4 banker boxes labeled legal, foundation, title, and press. On the bed sat a hard case of proposal boards and a gold folder marked Tidewell Transition Narrative. Narrative. There it was again. Not plan. Not sale. Narrative. I opened the title box first. By the time I heard footsteps in the corridor 10 minutes later, I understood why they were rushing. The title box contained survey extracts, photocopies of our deed history, zoning correspondence, council meeting notes, a map with the marsh strip shaded in red, and a term sheet for bridge financing through a private coastal lender called Meridian Harbor Capital. Grant had not merely found a bank willing to entertain him. He had found one of those sleek hungry financing shops that lend against movement, pressure, and assumptions, the sort of people who do not care whether a widower cries as long as the signatures arrive before close of business. The term sheet listed conditions. Recorded consent from the managing trustee. Confirmed donor support. Interim control agreement. Personal guarantees from Celia March and Grant Holloway pending title transfer. That line mattered. Personal guarantees. It meant their confidence was not quite as complete as they wanted Walter to believe. They were already out on the wire. Beneath the term sheet sat a draft packet of board minutes for an entity called Tidewell Holdings Advisory Council, which sounds impressive until you realize no such council had ever met in my house. Grant had built one on paper, populated it with the names of 2 dead donors, 1 winter resident in Naples who would sign anything mailed with a gold crest, and a local preservation chair who had not attended a single operational meeting in 9 years. The minutes described Eleanor as no longer capable of active oversight but deeply committed to the strategic transition of Tidewell into a mixed-use memorial destination. The phrasing was so clean I could almost smell Grant dictating it while Celia corrected the sentimental edges. Then I found the press box. Inside were draft talking points for donor concern if widower resists inevitable transition. There were quotes attributed to town leaders who had not given them. There was a statement prepared for release to the local paper expressing tenderness toward me while acknowledging that grief can distort a spouse's ability to honor a dying partner's final wishes. There was even a draft contingency note from the March Legacy Foundation promising to continue Eleanor's dream despite painful internal family difficulties. Internal family difficulties. Not fraud. Not coercion. Difficulties. In that box lay the corpse of my public reputation waiting for the right morning release. The foundation box was worse. Bellwether Heritage Solutions was owned through 2 shell layers by Holloway Meridian Consulting, Grant's firm. The floral overage was fiction. The logistics overage was fiction. The donor management retainer was fiction. Even the memorial orchestra, which had been perfectly competent but modestly priced local musicians last spring when the bishop's widower died, had somehow become a premium legacy ensemble at 4 times market rate. Nearly every inflated line item looped back to Grant. He had turned Eleanor's death into a self-paying machine and dressed it in ribbon. At the very bottom of the box sat the black trust binder with brass corners. I knew the weight of it before I touched it. Eleanor and I had revised the trust 7 years earlier after a storm surge damaged the shoreline path and 3 separate developers came sniffing around the road frontage within the same month. He had been irritated enough by their persistence to spend 2 full afternoons with our attorney, Benjamin Cross, building what he jokingly called the widower proofing and scavenger clause. Those were his words. His idea, not mine. She had said any family foolish enough to pressure me after her death deserved what happened next. I opened the binder on the bed and turned to the property governance section. There it was. If Tidewell House or any part of the primary parcel were ever pledged, leveraged, marketed, or preliminarily transferred without written attestation from both acting trustees and certified notice to Benjamin Cross, the estate would trigger an automatic protective conveyance. The operational control of the inn, the ballroom, the cottages, the south field, and the Rose grounds would move immediately into a widower and staff preservation trust governed by named successor stewards. Not Celia. Not Grant. Not even Eleanor's bloodline by default. The successors were me, June Bell, and Lydia Sloane. Lydia had once been our controller. She retired to Beaufort 5 years earlier with bad knees, excellent instincts, and a mind so exact she could smell fraud the way sailors smell lightning. I had not spoken to her in months. Suddenly I needed her before dawn. There was more. Eleanor had added a second rider after Celia married Grant. If any family member or outside partner attempted to use memorial funds, charitable pledges, or public representation of Eleanor's legacy to influence a sale of Tidewell House, that person would be forever barred from management, trusteeship, occupancy rights, and beneficiary control of the primary parcel. Forever barred. Eleanor did not always reach hard conclusions, but when she did, she wrote them like shutters in a hurricane. I sat there on the bed in room 7 with the trust binder open across my knees and felt two emotions at once. Relief, because the land still had teeth. Grief, because Eleanor had apparently anticipated this kind of hunger from his own child and never told me how fully. I do not know whether he spared me that knowledge out of love or cowardice. The dead do not answer follow-up questions. The footsteps outside stopped. A key touched the lock. I shut the binder, slid it into the garment bag case on the floor, and crossed to the wardrobe just as the temporary coordinator entered with a tablet in hand. Her name was Portia Vane, and she looked exactly like someone who had been hired to iron disaster into elegance. Long black dress, severe hair, expensive watch, useful face. She took one look at me standing in the room and recovered so quickly I almost admired it. "Mr. March," she said, "I did not realize you were using this room." "That makes 2 of us," I said. I was under the impression it remained a guest room, not the annex to my own funeral accounting. She glanced once toward the bed where the boxes sat, then back at me. "Celia asked me to centralize event materials for efficiency." "You mean concealment?" Her expression did not change. "Would you like me to move the files elsewhere?" "No," I said. "I would like you to go downstairs, tell Celia that dessert is delayed because one of her contractors is standing in front of me without written authorization to hold copied title documents in a locked guest room, and then wait in the veranda where I can see you." Portia considered defiance. Then she looked at the open garment case where the black binder edge showed by less than an inch and made the correct professional choice. She left without another word. I carried the trust binder under my shawl to the old back office above the kitchen where no guest from Atlanta would think to look because it smells of inventory paper, stale cinnamon, and institutional coffee. June met me halfway up the stair with an armful of invoices. Mateo had bought us time by announcing, to the entire ballroom, that Eleanor's favorite chocolate torte had suffered a cooling issue and would be replated. I could have kissed him for the lie. By 10:15, June, Mateo, and I had built the first honest table of the evening. Bellwether invoices. Donor pledge cards. Foundation brochures. Scanned title packets. The trust binder. June's memory of who moved what. Mateo's record of ordered goods versus served goods. A printed schedule showing the study signing window. A handwritten list of which guests had arrived with actual grief and which had arrived with acquisition interest. There is no substitute for trusted staff once a family turns predatory. Blood gives people access. Work gives people evidence. I called Lydia first. She answered on the second ring with the crisp breath of a woman who keeps her phone near the bed because she expects the world to need correcting. "Harold," she said, "it is after 10. Someone had better be dead again." "He is," I said. "That is half the problem." By the time I finished, Lydia was silent for 2 full beats. Then she said, "Do not sign a napkin. Do not leave that binder unattended. Photograph every page that mentions Bellwether, Meridian Harbor, and donor funds. Then call Benjamin Cross before midnight, because if Eleanor's trigger clause was activated by marketing or leverage, he will already have been notified. That possibility had not occurred to me, though it should have. Eleanor's lawyer, Benjamin Cross, was many things. Slow to laugh. Exacting. Unimpressed by everyone. But he was not inattentive. If someone had filed, copied, circulated, or pledged anything substantial against Tidewell within the channels Eleanor flagged, Benjamin might already be awake and furious. Lydia told me to look for one more thing. Not the trust. The old shoreline easement letter Eleanor tucked into the binder after the council threatened road expansion. Why? Because if Grant is selling development on the road frontage and event lawns, he may not understand that half the parcel's market value depends on access assumptions Eleanor cut off years ago. And if he does not understand that, he may have guaranteed money he cannot actually unlock. I found the easement rider within minutes. It was better than Lydia promised. 15 years earlier, when the county wanted marsh access and tourist cut-throughs, Eleanor negotiated a conservation access agreement that preserved the shoreline, locked event capacity on certain acres, and restricted commercial intensification unless existing family governance conditions were satisfied. In plain language, the more aggressively a new owner tried to monetize the parcel, the more likely the whole use structure would tangle in hearings, reversions, and conservation review. Eleanor had protected the place from being loved to death by the wrong people. Grant had either missed that or assumed he could overpower it with money and timing. That was when the outline of my revenge first became clear. Not rescue. Not denial. Exposure. If I simply refused the documents, Celia and Grant would shift at dawn. They would release their prepared statements, mourn my instability, rally donors, freeze vendors, whisper to the council, and make me look like a widower clinging to a doomed-in out of sentiment. The trust clause might save the property eventually, but the social and financial damage would spread fast. Walter might still wobble. The donors might still panic. The staff might still suffer. No. Refusal alone would only make me the obstacle. What I needed was reversal. I needed them to overcommit in public and then discover the ground was gone beneath the exact structure they built. So I called Benjamin Cross. He answered with no greeting, which is how men like Benjamin show respect after hours. Cross. It's Harold. He listened the whole way through, which is rarer than kindness and usually more useful. When I told him about the sale announcement, the bridge financing, the donor foundation, the copied trust binder, and the Bellwether invoices, he interrupted only once. Did you sign anything? No. Did you authorize any board, advisory, or transition body? No. Did Eleanor ever approve a mixed-use sale to Holloway interests? He said, and I quote, that Grant would turn the south field into parking and try to call it stewardship. Benjamin actually exhaled through his nose. That, he said, sounds like Eleanor. Then his tone hardened. The trigger is already live. What do you mean? At 6:42 this evening, an automated notice reached my office from Meridian Harbor's council. They requested confirmation of trustee alignment on a preliminary bridge structure attached to a future transfer. They did not know Eleanor's rider would flag it. I did. I have already prepared a temporary conveyance packet into the Widower and Staff Preservation Trust. If you, June Bell, and Lydia Sloan execute before noon tomorrow, the primary parcel steps out from under any transition scheme based on Eleanor's family line or memorial representation. The simplicity of that sentence nearly made me laugh. Grant thought he had built a bridge. Eleanor had built a trap door beneath it years earlier. Benjamin told me something else. Simon Vale's people had called his office twice that week asking whether the March family had clean alignment. He said they sounded impatient, not fully informed, and far more concerned with road frontage rights than memorial ideals. In Benjamin's opinion, Grant had pitched Simon speed he could not guarantee and had done so on the assumption that Grief would supply the missing signatures. "Can you come tonight?" I asked. "No," he said. "And if I did, it would spook them into caution." "Better. Let them think they still own the timing. I can meet you at 8 tomorrow with the conveyance packet. Until then, gather proof, preserve the staff, and do not let them remove records from the property." I asked what he would do if Grant tried filing anything overnight. He said, with rare pleasure, I would let him. When I ended the call, I stood very still in the back office and looked at the table crowded with invoices, copied signatures, inflated memorial costs, donor cards, and Eleanor's careful old protections. June was studying me. Mateo was pretending not to. "Well," June said at last. "Well," I answered. "We host breakfast at 8. We give them exactly enough rope to think it is silk." June smiled for the first time all night. "What do you need from us?" "Everything honest," I said. "Nothing dramatic. Tonight they go on believing tomorrow belongs to them. By lunch, I want every donor who pledged under false memorial terms reachable, every copied receipt preserved, every staff member paid, every lock they think they control quietly changed, and the ballroom reset for a private signing breakfast." "A breakfast," Mateo repeated. "Yes. If people are going to ruin themselves, I prefer good coffee on the table." Then I added the thing that made both of them straighten. "And June, no one leaves with boxes. Not Portia. Not Grant. Not Celia. If they want out tonight, they may leave with coats and handbags. Everything else stays." June nodded once. "Consider the house closed. That is why some people become indispensable. Not because they flatter. Because when the time comes, they understand exactly what protecting a place requires." We worked until nearly 1 in the morning while the last guests trickled out through the marsh veranda and the quartet packed away Grief at a respectable hourly rate. I went downstairs only once more before bed, long enough to let Celia see me speaking with Simon Vale near the front stair. I gave Simon my softest hostess smile and said how thrilled I was that we could all continue the discussion over breakfast. His relief was visible. Grant saw it from across the room and relaxed for the first time in hours. Good, I thought. Relax. That is when the cleanest cracks usually widen. I did not sleep more than 2 hours that night, and neither did the house. Old inns have their own nocturnal intelligence. Pipes knock, ice shifts in coolers, far hinges settle, the kitchen compressor kicks at irrational times, and every corridor carries information if you have lived long enough to hear the difference between movement and anxiety. Around 2:30, I heard Portia's careful steps on the east hall and June's heavier decisive answer near the service door. At 3:10, a car pulled into the side gravel, idled 2 minutes, and left when no one opened. At 4, rain moved over the marsh in a low silver sheet and made the porch rails smell like summer before dawn. I lay on top of the bedspread in Eleanor's room with the black trust binder beside me and looked at the ceiling fan turning through the dark like a slow deliberate thought. Grief changes shape when money touches it. Before that night, my grief had been private and physical. Her slippers still under the chair. Her cough drops in the side drawer. The hollow in the mattress. The smell of her lavender soap. The way I still turned to say something at dusk and met only the window. After that night, grief sharpened. It stopped being only loss and became insult. They had not merely come for the inn. They had tried to turn the final week of my wife's life into leverage and the first week after her death into liquidity. Some wounds do not soften a man. They clarify him. At 5:45, I dressed in gray, combed my hair, and went down to the old accounting room while the rain finished itself over the marsh. June already had coffee on. Mateo was coaxing biscuit dough in the kitchen and muttering with the serenity of a man who intended to feed the guilty before they were ruined. At 6:15, Lydia Sloane arrived from Beaufort in a navy raincoat and walking shoes with salt on the heels. She kissed my cheek once, glanced at the stacks of evidence, and said, "I see the children have chosen cannibalism." That was Lydia. Nothing frightened her once it was named. We spent the next hour dividing the battlefield. Lydia reviewed the bellwether invoices and foundation pledges while June cross-checked every build memorial enhancement against actual deliveries and staff hours. Mateo supplied printed kitchen requisitions that proved half the premium imported ingredients on Grant's invoices never touched my pantry. I photographed every relevant page and sent copies to Benjamin's secure link, one donor I trusted absolutely, and a private cloud account Celia did not know existed because I built it years earlier after a florist's grandson accidentally wiped a season of wedding files, and I promised never again to trust one machine with the whole truth. If you are still with me here, take one quick second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Also tell me whether you would have thrown them out that first night or done what I did and let breakfast happen. I mean that honestly. Some people believe dignity means a slammed door. I believed dignity meant letting the right people watch the lie collapse in daylight. And if you have ever had someone weaponize your own good manners against you, stay with me, because breakfast was where their confidence started turning against them. By 7:30, the inn smelled like bacon, coffee, wet cedar, and storm-cooled roses. I told the front desk girls to call every donor and investor still staying on property and invite them to a private legacy breakfast in the ballroom at 8:15. I used Celia's phrase intentionally. Legacy breakfast. I instructed them to say Harold March wished to thank those who cared enough to remain for the next step. That sentence pulled exactly the people I wanted. Then Benjamin Cross arrived. He came in through the front hall with 2 legal cases, a navy umbrella, and the expression of a man mildly inconvenienced by the need to ruin people before office hours. He wore a charcoal suit and did not so much as glance at the condolence flowers still fading in the entry. Benjamin never wastes sentiment on decor. We met in the back office with Lydia and June. He reviewed the trust binder, the copied title packets, the donor materials, and the bellwether structure with short efficient questions. Then he pulled out the conveyance packet and laid it flat on the table. The Widower and Staff Preservation Trust, he said, becomes active upon execution by the current acting trustee and both named successor stewards. Transfer of operational control is immediate. Public recording can happen after filing, but legal effect begins once signed, witnessed, and time-stamped. Additionally, I have drafted notice to Meridian Harbor and Simon Vale's counsel that the property marketed last night is no longer available for transition under the assumptions previously represented. I asked whether filing before breakfast would spook them. Benjamin gave me a look usually reserved for underperforming trustees. Harold, he said, legal effect is one matter. Public revelation is another. We are not hiding anything. We are sequencing it. That is why I trusted him. Not because he was warm. Because he understood architecture in a language adjacent to mine. We signed at 7:58. Harold March, acting trustee. June Bell, successor steward. Lydia Sloan, successor steward. Benjamin as witness. Then he time-stamped the packet, sealed copies, and called his office to trigger immediate courier filing with the county recorder and council notices by electronic service. By the time Celia picked up her coffee cup in the ballroom, the inn had already stepped out from under the future she thought she was selling. There remained the matter of making that future expensive. Benjamin asked me whether I wanted quiet enforcement or public correction. Public, I said. Quiet leaves too much room for them to call themselves misunderstood later. He nodded, though I think he would personally have preferred a cold letter and a week of depositions. Lawyers often distrust spectacle because so many of them are bad at it. I am not. I spent 31 years turning weather, family tension, bad catering, church politics, and human vanity into evenings people later called beautiful. A ballroom is a weapon if you understand timing. At 8:15, the guests arrived. Not all of them. Enough. Walter Finn. Moira Spence. Simon Vale and his acquisitions associate. The mayor's wife, who had written a check the night before and wanted assurance the foundation was real. 2 preservation donors from Charleston. 1 councilman who smiled too broadly. Portia, carrying her tablet like a shield. Celia and Grant entered together a minute later and stopped almost imperceptibly when they saw Benjamin by the sideboard and Lydia at my right hand. Grant recovered first. "Harold," he said, "I did not realize you planned to involve outside counsel this early." I poured coffee for Moira and said, "You announced the sale of my property at my wife's memorial. We are well beyond early." The breakfast tables were set simply on purpose. White cloths, silver coffee pots, biscuits, fruit, deviled eggs, smoked trout, and no flowers except a few clipped rosemary sprigs in low bowls. I wanted nothing for people to hide behind. Light from the marsh windows fell clean across the room. The renderings from the previous night had been removed. In their place stood 3 easels turned backward, their faces concealed. Simon noticed. Good. Once everyone sat, I rose only long enough to thank them for staying. Then I remained standing by the head table rather than returning to my chair, which subtly denied Celia the impression that this was her room again. "Yesterday evening," I said, "many of you were told you were participating in the launch of a project honoring my wife, Eleanor March. Before any further discussion occurs, there are 4 facts you need." Grant opened his mouth. Benjamin lifted one hand. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "you will have plenty of opportunity to explain yourself after Mr. March finishes, provided explanation remains possible." That shut him for the moment. I continued. "First, I never authorized the sale announcement made last night. Second, I never authorized the March Legacy Foundation to accept donor commitments in connection with a transfer of Tidewell House. Third, several invoices and representations made in support of last night's announcement are under legal challenge as of this morning. And fourth, as of 7:58 today, Tidewell House and its primary operating parcel are no longer available for the transition structure described last night." The room did not gasp. It inhaled. That is how important people do shock. Celia stood. "Harold, this is irresponsible." "No, darling," I said. "Yesterday was irresponsible. Today is bookkeeping." Walter Finn looked from me to Grant. Simon Vale leaned back slightly, which in developer language means I may have been lied to and I intend to find out by whom. Moira clasped her coffee cup with both hands. Grant tried to seize tone. "There appears to be some grief-driven confusion about sequence," he said. The transition terms were preliminary. Eleanor's vision was clear. "We have emails, donor notes, and board minutes confirming strategic intent." "Do you?" Benjamin said pleasantly. "Then perhaps you can explain why Bellwether Heritage Solutions billed memorial donors for services routed through your own consulting network." Portia's face lost color. Grant did not answer at once. Benjamin continued. "Or why the bridge structure presented to Meridian Harbor relied on trustee alignment that did not exist. Or why 2 deceased individuals appear in your advisory minutes. Or why your wife's stepfather was publicly represented as supportive of a transaction she had not seen. That was the first fall. Small, but audible. I turned the first easel. It held enlarged copies of the Bellwether invoice chain, highlighted routing information, and the ownership structure connecting the so-called heritage vendor back to Grant's company. I turned the second. Donor pledge cards next to the draft foundation statements and the transition account references that several donors in the room had never been told about. I turned the third. The title and trust excerpt showing the protective clause Eleanor drafted years earlier. Alongside the newly executed widower and staff preservation trust acknowledgement with this morning's time stamp. The councilman blanched first. He knew enough law to recognize when a room stopped being political and became evidentiary. Celia looked at Grant. That was the moment she realized the air was no longer built for confidence. Grant, however, still thought speed might save him. "These are distortions," he said. "Bellwether was a project management vehicle. Standard practice. The donor account exists to receive and stage commitments until final deployment. The trust issue is an internal family matter. None of this changes the fundamental reality that Tidewell requires restructuring if it is to survive. Lydia spoke for the first time. Her voice carried like cut glass. You padded a memorial, she said. You cross-billed grief, legal printing, consultant fees, and donor management through a shell you controlled. You floated financing on property you did not control. And you built a public narrative around a dead man's wishes using draft materials you hoped no one old enough to remember his actual signature would inspect. If this is your idea of restructuring, Mr. Holloway, one wonders what you do when you dislike a building. There are lines a room remembers. That was one. Walter asked the question I had been waiting for. Grant, did Meridian Harbor know the primary parcel could shift under a protective conveyance? Grant answered too fast. That clause was dormant. Benjamin corrected him. Was. Simon Vale leaned forward. I beg your pardon, he said, but did you present my firm with a property packet attached to a transaction structure that no longer exists? No one answered quickly enough. That was the second fall. Moira then asked me whether the $900,000 in donor commitments were safe. I told the truth. The funds not yet moved remain safe if promptly withdrawn or frozen. The funds already moved are now part of a dispute. But no donor here is required to let their grief finance a commercial scheme against their will. Benjamin's office has prepared notice forms for any guest wishing to suspend or revoke a pledge made under false memorial representation. June and the front desk girls, at my signal, entered with folders. Clean white folders. Each containing revocation forms, summaries of the disputed entities, and contact information for counsel. I watched the folders land at place settings like cards in a game my opponents had not realized changed overnight. Celia finally found anger strong enough to overtake performance. You sanctimonious old bitch, she said. The room went still in a new way. You must understand, she continued before anyone could stop her, how many years I have watched this place be wasted on table settings and rose bushes while real money circled it. My father clung to sentiment because Harold fed it to him in courses. Every storm, every tax year, every deferred repair, and still she played innkeeper while the land sat there. She pointed toward the marsh windows as if the view itself had insulted her. You all see charm, she said to the room. I see 30 years of buried potential. This property could have become something serious a decade ago. Instead she kept it small, personal, feminine, inefficient. She kept it hers. There it was. Not legacy. Resentment. Not stewardship. Humiliation at needing the old thing to remain old while she wanted capital, proof, status, escape. I almost thanked her for speaking plainly, because the room needed that sentence more than any lawyer's note. Donors rarely enjoy being told their beloved local institution is really just a feminine inefficiency standing in the way of adult money. Grant hissed her name, but it was too late. Simon Vale turned his head with open disdain. Walter removed his glasses and cleaned them, which he only ever did when he wanted extra seconds to think without revealing concern. The mayor's wife placed her revocation folder directly into her handbag before anyone else moved. If you are still listening now, press subscribe, because this was the exact moment the mask slipped and never went back on. Public greed always sounds different once it stops pretending to be concern. And what came next finished them far more effectively than any shouted argument could have. Grant tried one last professional pivot. Even if donor staging becomes contested, he said, the underlying economics remain. Tidewell cannot support its current cost profile. The development offer is still the only rational path to preserve value. I looked at him with real curiosity then, because I wanted to see how far arrogance could carry a man once the floor had already opened. You still think value is the same thing as access, I said. What does that mean? It means Eleanor knew exactly what kind of son-in-law he was getting. He knew you would stand in a room like this one day and speak about rational paths while counting parking spaces where her mother's camellias once bloomed. So she wrote for you. Not to you. For you. Benjamin handed Simon a copy of the shoreline easement and capacity restrictions. Simon read the first page, then the second, then looked up with the patient murderous calm of a man who has just realized his time has been stolen by someone dumber than he was led to believe. You marketed me a parcel, he said to Grant, whose commercial intensification depends on family governance conditions your side cannot satisfy and shoreline constraints you did not disclose. Grant began saying something about phased entitlements. Simon cut him off. And you tied my firm publicly to a memorial launch before securing title alignment. Did you imagine I enjoy being used as floral backdrop for your domestic fraud? That was the third fall. And now, because I wanted complete ruin instead of partial discomfort, I chose generosity. I told the room that breakfast would continue, that no guest was obliged to rush out in discomfort, and that Mateo had prepared pecan sticky buns because Eleanor loved them on rainy mornings. It sounds small. It was not. Hospitality in a crisis creates contrast. It reminds decent people who the adults are. Then I added the knife. Mr. Holloway, since you have spoken so freely of economics, perhaps you should also explain your personal guarantees to Meridian Harbor. Grant went utterly still. Celia turned toward him. Personal what? He did not answer. Benjamin did. Pending title transfer, he said, Meridian Harbor required both Mr. Holloway and Ms. March to guarantee exposure on the bridge structure. Since the primary parcel is no longer available under the assumed transition, any costs already incurred, fees already advanced, or representations already made may now rest personally with the parties who made them. Celia stared at Grant as if seeing him for the first time in proper daylight. How much? Grant said nothing. Walter did the math faster than the rest. If you layered lobbying, concept fees, staging, consultant draws, and hold costs on a failed bridge structure, he said slowly, you could be looking at high six figures before lunch. Celia sat down without meaning to. That was the fourth fall. And because a room like that deserves complete information, I told the donors one final thing. Eleanor's actual provision for Tidewell, I said, was not commercial liquidation. It was continuity with boundaries. The Widower and Staff Preservation Trust would keep the inn operational, maintain the memorial calendar as planned, protect the shoreline and Rose grounds, and publish an independent accounting of all disputed memorial expenditures within 10 days. Anyone misled under Eleanor's name would receive direct notice. Anyone who truly wished to honor him could do so later, without deceit, pressure, or developers hiding behind condolence ribbons. Moira Spence stood first. She walked around the table, came straight to me, and kissed my cheek. I am so very sorry, she said. Then she turned to Simon and added, I will not fund another civilized ambush while I have breath in me. Others followed. The Charleston donors. The mayor's wife. Walter, eventually. Simon did not apologize. He did something better. He called his lawyer from my veranda and terminated every pending conversation with Grant within earshot of the ballroom. Portia Vane vanished sometime during the third fall. Sensible woman. Celia and Grant remained at the head table as the room emptied around them. June had the good manners to leave their coffee warm. I did not let myself enjoy their shock for more than a minute, because rooms do not stay honest by themselves after the principal liars are cornered. They must be managed, reassured, paid, and fed. That is the part revenge stories often leave out. Real victory is administrative before it becomes emotional. By 10:30, Benjamin had served formal notices to Meridian Harbor, Simon Vale's counsel, Walter Finn's office, and the temporary foundation board. Lydia began a clean operating review with the front desk and accounting girls. June changed the locks on the carriage office, the study, room 7, the cellar records cabinet, and Eleanor's old map drawer. Mateo sent sticky buns to every donor still on property because rattled rich people make dangerous phone calls when left hungry. I gathered the staff in the kitchen and told them the simple truth. No one was losing wages. No one was being sold. No one was to discuss rumors with guests. If asked, they were to say Tidewell House remained under lawful management and the Memorial Foundation announcement had been withdrawn pending review. You could see the relief travel through the kitchen like heat. Not joy. Relief. People who work in family businesses know how quickly bad blood can take payroll hostage. At 11, Walter Finn asked to see me privately. We met in the old chart room off the front hall, where Eleanor used to hang barometers and pretend he could smell weather 2 hours before rain. Walter closed the door, removed his glasses, and looked much older than he had the night before. I should have called you before any discussion reached that room, he said. Yes, you should have. He accepted that without defense. He said Grant had approached him 6 weeks earlier with what sounded like a preliminary legacy restructuring, not a memorial ambush. He said Celia described it as Eleanor's late life wish to reduce my burden and convert the inn into a more sustainable mixed-use asset. He said there had been urgency around concept fees and donor timing, but nothing, in his telling, that suggested forged governance or shell billing. I asked whether he truly believed Eleanor would let a bridge lender and an out-of-town developer into the title path without speaking to me. Walter looked at the window. No, he said quietly. I believed grief makes fools of better men than me. That answer nearly softened me. Nearly. Then he told me the piece I needed most. Meridian Harbor's fee exposure was worse than Benjamin guessed. Grant had accepted a ticking commitment structure through Monday noon. If the bridge did not close, the advisory, underwriting, legal, and hold costs would roll into personal liability immediately. Not maybe. Immediately. How much? At current paper, Walter said, somewhere north of $640,000. Possibly more if Vale's people pursue their broken exclusivity claim. Now the urgency had a clock I could hang on the wall. No wonder Grant tried to sell my life at dessert. Walter also admitted one more thing. Grant had mentioned a fallback asset more than once if Tidewell dragged. He called it the road front solution. I asked what that meant. Walter said he assumed some separate parcel or personal collateral. He had not pressed. The road frontage at Tidewell included the old packing shed, the gravel lane, and 2 acres Eleanor once considered spinning into a seasonal market for local growers but never did because traffic studies made him grumpy. If Grant believed he had a fallback there, he was operating on bad assumptions or a hidden paper trail. Either way, I intended to find out before he did something truly reckless. After Walter left, Celia came to me alone. That surprised me. She had always preferred triangulation. As a girl, if she wanted a bigger allowance, she asked Eleanor in front of me and me in front of Eleanor so neither of us could tell where the first yes began. As a woman, she used boards, donors, and husbands the same way. To find her alone in the library just after noon, standing beside the history shelves in last night's cream suit with the jacket gone and her hair finally loosening from its pins, felt almost intimate. Almost. Grant is on the phone with Meridian, she said without greeting. Simon has stopped answering. Portia is gone. Walter is pretending neutrality, which means he is already choosing survival. Congratulations. I was shelving guest history binders. I did not turn. Thank you. You enjoy this. No, I said. I enjoy clarity. There is a difference. She laughed once, bitterly. You always did love words that make control sound moral. That was rich coming from the woman who tried to trademark grief before the candles cooled. I turned then. She looked drawn, angrier than broken, which told me shame had not yet outrun appetite. What do you want, Celia? I want to know when you decided I was temporary. There are questions so old they enter a room before the person asking them. That was one. I had felt it in her for 30 years. Not every day. Not always even consciously. But there, the whole time, like low static under music. Temporary, I repeated. Do not insult me by pretending you don't understand. Tidewell was my mother's first. Her family before that. You came in with ledgers and schedules and suddenly every room answered to you. My father looked at you like order had descended from heaven, and from then on I was the child in someone else's story. Every holiday, every summer, every committee dinner, you at his side, you in the office, you with the keys, you with the budgets, you with the staff who adored you because you paid them on time and remembered their children. You did not have to raise your voice to take over. You just stayed. And everything tilted. There are two kinds of family accusations. The ones built on lies. And the ones built on pain that has been stewing so long it begins recruiting lies to defend itself. Celia's belonged to the second kind. I said, your mother died. I did not do that to you. No, she said. But you benefited from it. I let the sentence land. Then I answered as cleanly as I could. I married a widow with a daughter who needed more than I knew how to give and less than I was allowed to give. That is the truth. I stayed because your mother loved me and because the inn needed 2 adults if it was going to survive. The rest is what you decided survival meant. Her eyes shone then, not with tears but fury. Easy for you to say. You got the partnership. The keys. The signatures. The room at his deathbed. And what exactly did you get, Celia? Be honest. She said nothing. So I told her. Tuition twice. A condo deposit after Boston. The wedding she paid for and the second time she paid to keep it from becoming gossip. Seed money for your first non-profit consultancy. Then rescue money when that collapsed. Then a salary from the inn board he invented mostly to keep you close without giving you operational control. Then another $75,000 when you said you and Grant were restructuring your future and needed breathing room. I know because Lydia handled the transfer. Shall I go on? She went white. Eleanor had been generous to a fault. Celia always remembered the years he said no. I remembered the years he paid anyway. You think money was the point, she said at last. This morning it certainly seems to be. She stepped closer. Grant said if we could close Tidewell, all of it would be fixed. There it was. Not legacy. Not grief. Not Eleanor. Need. What exactly is broken, I asked. She looked away. That told me enough to press. How much is Grant carrying? It is not just him, she said. We have obligations. That word again. Which obligations? She folded her arms as if cold had entered the room. The development in Charleston stalled. The marina parcel in Tampa fell through. Then the Savannah retail syndicate pulled 2 anchor tenants. Grant backstopped more than he should have because everyone said it would turn once rates came down. Then rates did not come down. Simon offered a way out if Tidewell moved quickly. The memorial timing made donors receptive, the council receptive, the press receptive. One clean transaction and we were free. Free. I asked what free meant. It meant no more extensions, no more humiliating calls, no more pretending at dinners, no more liquidating jewelry to cover a month, no more lying to each other about what was temporary. It meant we could start again. I looked at her a long time. And you believed the correct place to start again was from inside my wife's coffin. She winced. Good. Then she said the one thing that killed whatever softness remained in me that afternoon. If you had just signed, none of this would have become ugly. There it was. The oldest rot at the center. Not remorse. Resentment that I had made the theft less convenient. I told her to leave the library. She didn't move. Grant will not survive this, she said. I thought of the shell invoices, the donor staging, the copied signatures, the Atlanta coordinator, the pressure wrapped in condolence ribbons. Neither did Eleanor, I said. Yet somehow you found time to print prospectus boards before his obituary dried. She slapped me. Not hard enough to hurt much. Hard enough to finish something. I did not slap her back. I simply opened the library door and called June. June appeared in less than 5 seconds, because faithful staff always know when a family conversation has reached the edge of decency. Ms. March is leaving the library now, I said. She is not to access the office, study, cellar, accounting room, or guest records. Celia stared at me as if I had finally become the villain she needed. You would throw me out of my own home. I corrected her. This was never your home. It was your mother's house, then mine to manage with him, and now a trust you disqualified yourself from before breakfast. She left without another word. But on the threshold, she turned and said, very softly, you always did underestimate what people do when they're cornered. I answered just as softly. No, darling. I hosted enough weddings to know exactly what people do when their exit route narrows. That is why I locked the silver early. The rest of that afternoon passed in motions so practical a stranger might not have recognized them as war. Benjamin filed the first civil fraud notices. Lydia and I isolated every operating account. June inventoried the silver, wine cellar, archive room, and owner's suite. Mateo fed the staff a late lunch and sent coffee to the Charleston donors still writing revocation statements in the sunroom. Walter returned with revised banking confirmations showing Tidewell's operating line remained untouched by Grant's bridge scheme. Simon's assistant called twice asking whether I would entertain a future non-commercial preservation partnership once the smoke cleared. I told her that after what her employer had allowed into my ballroom, he could wait until the second coming. Then, just before 4, the final useful gift of the day arrived. A messenger from Meridian Harbor delivered a sealed notice to Grant in person. Grant was in the courtyard with his phone to his ear and his confidence in tatters. June, who happened to be deadheading roses nearby with a basket over one arm, watched the exchange and later repeated it almost word for word. Grant opened the packet, read half a page, and said, loudly enough for 2 gardeners and 1 houseman to hear, you cannot accelerate that without the veil side still live. The messenger apparently replied that misrepresentation, title uncertainty, and reputational exposure made acceleration not only possible but prudent. Grant then asked for 24 hours. The messenger said he had until Monday noon. Monday noon. Exactly the clock Walter predicted. That notice changed the air again. Celia and Grant did not leave that night. Of course they didn't. Cornered people cling to wallpaper and call it strategy. They retreated to the owner's suite in the main house and spent the evening on separate phones. I could see their lights from the marsh veranda after sunset. One room on, one room off, then both on, then shadows moving fast behind curtains. There is something almost tender about watching villains discover each other as liabilities. At 7:30, Benjamin left for town with promises of return at first light if necessary. Lydia stayed in the blue room because I asked her to. June refused to go home. I walked the porch alone for 20 minutes before bed and let the marsh wind cool the anger behind my eyes. The inn had survived the day. That mattered. But survival was not enough. By Monday noon, I wanted something better than mere defense. I wanted their collapse to arrive through the exact channels they trusted most. Reputation, money, and audience. That was when I remembered Eleanor's Founders films. Every spring for the last 12 years, on Founders Weekend, Eleanor recorded a short welcome message for guests who gathered in the ballroom on Saturday evening. Sometimes he was away at medical tests. Sometimes storms delayed him. Sometimes he simply enjoyed the theater of appearing on screen before walking in from the back doors 5 minutes later to applause and bourbon. She kept the files in the projection cabinet above the ballroom sound room. No one had mentioned them since her death because the memorial had swallowed the calendar. But Founders Saturday still sat 2 nights away. Eleanor had recorded one this year. I knew it because in February she spent half an afternoon choosing between 2 ties and asking whether the camera angle made him look less tired than he felt. He said he wanted to speak about endurance, old houses, and people who save institutions without ever putting their names on the front steps. I told him that sounded suspiciously like he meant to flatter me in public. He smiled and said perhaps I had earned a little vanity by association. The film might contain nothing useful beyond affection. Or it might contain the plainest version of Eleanor's actual intentions before Grant wrapped them in brochures. I went upstairs to the projection cabinet myself. The projection cabinet above the ballroom has a swollen door and a lock that sticks in wet weather. Eleanor always insisted on keeping his yearly film archives there instead of the office safe because, in her words, if a room is built for speeches it might as well store a few. The sound room smelled of dust, warm wires, and old velvet curtains. I found the label drive where she kept this season's Founders materials tucked inside a cigar tin with a grease pencil note that said for Saturday unless I miraculously become younger by then. That was Eleanor. Always trying to soften her own decline for my sake. Back in the blue room, with Lydia half asleep in the chair and the bedside lamp turned low, I played the file on my laptop wearing headphones so I would not wake the hole in with my wife's voice. She appeared on screen seated in the library, the marsh light behind her, jacket on, scarf slightly crooked because she always pulled one side looser when she thought no one would notice. She looked thinner than I remembered from that day and somehow more alive than I had allowed myself to recall. He smiled into the lens, then into whatever future room would eventually hear her. If you are watching this, she said, it means Founders Saturday arrived and I either could not make the stairs gracefully or Harold joked that pre-recorded Eleanor was more manageable than live Eleanor. In either case, welcome. She went on like that for a minute, charming, reflective, talking about weathering, cedar, hospitality, and the kind of inheritance that lives in routines more than signatures. Then her tone changed. Not dramatically. Eleanor was never theatrical when it mattered most. It changed the way the tide changes under fog. Quietly, then all at once you understand the water is moving another direction. There are people, he said, who look at old places and see square footage before memory. There are also people who look at old places and see work, obligation, and the names of those who kept the roof from lifting in storms. If I have learned anything worth passing on, it is this. Never trust a person who speaks of legacy while reaching for leverage. One protects what exists. The other plans to borrow against it. I sat up straighter. Eleanor looked down once, perhaps at a note, then back to the camera. If, after my death, anyone tells you Tidewell should be sold in haste for my sake, they are lying. If anyone tells you a dead man wanted his flowers monetized, they are lying. If anyone pressures Harold in the name of my wishes, they are speaking for themselves, not me. She is the reason this house survived my charm, my bad timing, 3 storms, 1 cousin with a shrimp boat, and every season when sentiment alone would have bankrupted us. If you love this place, trust her first. My hands began to shake, just a little, there in the lamplight. Then came the part that finished it. Celia, if you are in the room for this, I hope you hear what I mean and not what you fear. Love is not title. Blood is not stewardship. I have provided for you in ways perhaps too gentle to improve you. But Tidewell is not a reward for wanting what it looks like from the drive. Tidewell belongs with the people who know what it costs at 6 in the morning when the pumps fail, a widower cries in the front parlor, and the cook has sliced his hand before breakfast. If you ever stand beside a man who tells you speed matters more than truth in this house, leave him on the porch. I played that section 3 times. Lydia, now fully awake, asked from the chair whether Eleanor had finally found his backbone on camera. I handed her one headphone and let her hear it herself. When it finished, she took off the earpiece and said, well. The old fool took his time, but at least he arrived before burial settled in. That film solved 2 problems at once. It gave me Eleanor's own public language against the sale, and it gave me something worse for Celia than a legal loss. It gave me his disappointment in plain view. Not shrill, not punitive, not shaped by my voice or Benjamin's drafting. His. Clean. Impossible to spin. I decided then what Saturday evening would become. Not merely Founders Weekend. Reclamation. But first we had to survive Friday and keep Grant from setting the house on fire metaphorically if not literally before Monday noon ruined him. Friday began with reporters. Of course it did. Once donor revocations start flying and a developer stops returning calls, local press develops a nose like a hunting dog. By 9 in the morning, a freelance columnist who had praised the memorial renderings the night before was at the front desk asking whether there had been an internal family misunderstanding over the future of Tidewell. By 10, a local station van rolled slowly past the drive. By 11, a preservation blogger had posted a fuzzy photo from the memorial and a caption wondering whether the widower opposed her late husband's final vision. Grant had moved faster than I hoped. Even cornered, he still trusted suggestion. So I moved faster. I called one brief press availability on the front steps at noon. No chairs. No podium. Just me in navy, Lydia at my left, June at the open doorway behind me, and Benjamin standing off to the side like a warning label with cuff links. I told them 3 simple truths. My wife's property was not for sale. A memorial announcement had been made without my authority. An independent accounting and legal review were underway regarding donor representations and vendor payments. Then I said Tidewell would honor Founders Weekend as planned and invited the town to join us Saturday evening to remember Eleanor properly, with no prospectus boards and no developer slides. I did not answer shouted questions about Celia or Grant. I did not use the word fraud. I did not need to. Precision leaves room for the guilty to fill the silence with their own panic. Reporters hate mystery less than. They hate a locked door, and I gave them exactly enough to return Saturday. That afternoon, Grant made his last reasonable attempt. He came to the Blue Room alone with a bottle of expensive bourbon in one hand and a typed settlement in the other. He set the bottle on the table like tribute and did not sit until I told him to, which I never did. Good. Let men stand when they are about to beg without admitting it. He said we were all adults, that Thursday had been emotional, that perhaps the memorial timing got ahead of itself, but there remained a rational path beneficial to everyone. He slid the settlement toward me. In exchange for withdrawing certain allegations, validating limited legacy planning discussions, and allowing a 90-day due diligence process on selected parcels, Celia and Grant would release all claim to direct operational control and publicly state there had simply been a misunderstanding during a difficult family week. Selected parcels, I repeated. The road front, he said. Packing shed acreage. The lane entry. Some parking reconfiguration. Nothing touching the heart of the inn. There it was. Walter's road front solution. Grant had already moved on from devouring the whole beast to cutting off a limb and calling it compromise. I asked how much Meridian Harbor needed by Monday. He said that was private. I said then so is my answer. He did not like that. His posture changed first. Then the softness left his tone. You are choosing spectacle over solvency, he said. You think that film of Eleanor, those old clauses, and a few offended donors will protect you from what comes next. Tidewell bleeds money in ways you romanticize. You have age on your side now because people still see a widower. In 6 months they will see an operator who tanked a community project out of pride. I asked whether Portia had always billed as heritage strategy or whether he paid extra when she handled his more intimate scheduling. That landed. I had found the proof that morning while reviewing bellwether card statements. 2 separate suite charges in Savannah under Portia's name and Grant's travel pattern on dates. Celia told us he was in Charleston with lenders. I did not care about the affair morally. I cared that secrecy makes excellent leverage when someone else built their whole rescue story on shared sacrifice. Grant's face did not collapse. Men like him are too practiced. It simply cooled. Be very careful, he said. No, I replied. You be careful. Monday noon is close enough now that I can smell it on your jacket. He left the bourbon. I poured it down the laundry sink after he was gone. Celia came at dusk. Not to apologize. To negotiate separately. She stood on the blue room threshold like an exhausted ambassador from a failing country and asked whether I would meet her on the east porch where Eleanor used to take evening tea. I considered refusing, then accepted because there are some humiliations that deserve sunset. The east porch looked over the hydrangea walk and the service road, less dramatic than the marsh side but quieter, more truthful. We sat in old cane chairs while the kitchen windows glowed below and swallows cut black arcs through the fading sky. Celia looked older than she had the day before. Anger had worn through enough of her polish to reveal plain strain beneath. How much does Grant owe, really? I asked. She did not deny the frame. Between everything, she said, maybe $1.5 million if Simon sues and Meridian accelerates. Maybe more if the Tampa thing collapses completely. I asked whether the road front plan was meant to cover it. Partly, she said. The rest would buy time. And after time. She looked out over the walk. After time we would have figured something out. That is what people say when they have mistaken delay for strategy. Then she told me the part she thought might buy mercy. Grant had promised that once Tidewell closed, he would take the proceeds, clear the urgent exposures, and purchase a smaller inn in cash under her name. Something easier. Something inland. No storms. No old staff with loyalties she could not control. No memory-heavy halls. She said it as if revealing a private dream, not a downgrade bought with my widowhood. So he was going to steal my life and reward you with a simpler imitation, I said. Her mouth tightened. You always make things uglier than they have to be. No, Celia. I make them visible. She turned on me then with the helpless ferocity of someone who finally sees the collapse but still cannot give up entitlement. What do you want from me? Public shame. Tears. Kneeling. I can do that if it gets me through Monday. I can stand in the ballroom and say Grant lied to me about half of it. I can say I was manipulated. I can cry. I can tell the press I was grieving and foolish and trusted the wrong man. Tell me the role and I will play it. It was one of the saddest things I ever heard her say, not because it moved me, but because it told me how little of herself she believed remained outside performance. I said, I do not need a role from you. I need the truth. For once. Not what saves your face. Not what hurts Grant. The truth. She laughed quietly. Then here it is. I hated watching you and my mother become a unit I could never enter. I hated the way staff loved you. I hated how every room in this house began to feel more efficient and less mine. I hated needing his checks. I hated how grateful everyone expected me to be. When Grant saw Tidewell as leverage, it felt like someone was finally speaking the language of power instead of duty. It made me feel less like a daughter waiting outside a locked office and more like a woman who could claim something. Claim what? She looked right at me. Space. That, more than any insult, told me who she was. Not a daughter robbed. A person who had confused possession with selfhood so completely she would have raised a house to hear her own name echo in the cleared ground. I said, then listen carefully. After Monday, you may blame Grant, blame me, blame your mother, blame weather, history, or every piece of furniture in this place. But the one thing you may not do is say you did not understand what you were doing. You knew enough. She stood. And you knew enough to stop me sooner, she said. Why didn't you? Because love makes fools of men too, I replied. I simply happened to recover faster. She left without goodbye. By midnight, Benjamin's office had served a preliminary preservation notice to every major vendor and donor. Lydia had secured payroll. June had stationed one night porter at the carriage office and another at the cellar stairs. Mateo had prepared enough pastry for Saturday's Founders guests to feed an army because, in his opinion, justice is best absorbed on a full stomach. I spent the late hour editing Eleanor's Founders film myself, removing only the opening joke about miraculous youth and leaving every word that mattered. Saturday morning dawned bright, wind scrubbed, and beautiful in the offensive way coastal mornings sometimes do after nights of family rot. By then the story had spread beyond Tidewell. The local paper ran a restrained online piece about disputed legacy plans. The preservation blogger amended her first post and added an update about donor concern. A regional gossip account picked up a photo of Celia leaving the memorial breakfast looking like bad cream had finally discovered consequence. People I had not heard from in years began sending messages that started with "I am sure there are two sides" and ended with "if you need anything I have always distrusted that man." Founders Saturday traditionally brought half the county through our doors by evening. Old families. Garden club women. Winter residents still lingering before summer heat. People who had danced in our ballroom, scattered ashes off our marsh dock, toasted golden anniversaries under our chandeliers, or simply liked standing on the veranda pretending they descended from more linen than they actually did. I decided not to cancel a single element. That was the point. Tidewell would not go dark so that Celia and Grant could later describe the week as a tragic interruption caused by an unstable widower. No. Tidewell would stay open, well-run, and more itself than ever. At noon, June told me Grant had left the property in a hired car and not returned. At 1, Walter called to say Meridian Harbor had engaged direct outside counsel and Simon Vale's firm was considering separate action. At 2, Benjamin sent word that the county had received the Preservation Trust filing in time, stamped it cleanly. At 3, Mateo iced the Founders' cakes and asked whether he should still place Eleanor's silver knife on the sideboard. I told him yes. Let the dead host his own correction. Then, at 4:10, we found Grant in the archive room. He had come back by the service corridor while the afternoon tours were crossing the Rose grounds and was halfway through the old guest register cabinet with a portable scanner in his hand when June caught him. She called for me once, sharp enough to cut metal, and by the time I arrived he was standing between the cabinet and the door as if posture alone could transform burglary into administrative access. "What exactly are you stealing now?" I asked. He said he was retrieving materials relevant to Eleanor's intent. That would have sounded almost noble if the guest register drawer were not hanging open and the scanner beside him had just copied 2 old board letters and Eleanor's handwritten founder speech drafts from 13 years earlier. June held up the inner envelope he had dropped. Inside was the one object I had not yet realized was missing. Eleanor's private letter to Founders Saturday, sealed and dated 2 weeks before her death. Grant's eyes moved to the envelope in June's hand. For the first time since Thursday, panic looked less like strategy and more like weather on him. He said, "Harold, don't be foolish. That may contain context you are not prepared for." I took the envelope from June and slipped it into my pocket. "Everything you say sounds like a man balancing on rotten planks," I told him. "Go wait in the front hall. You may stay for the program this evening if you wish to watch Eleanor choose for himself what context means." He did not go to the front hall. He left the house entirely. I opened the letter alone. Eleanor's handwriting on the envelope was tired but clear. "Harold, if found after I am gone or if some fool takes it too soon." That was the outside. Inside was a 3-page letter written in the voice he used only when he was done charming and ready to tell the simple ugly truth. He began with me. He said he was sorry for leaving loose weather around my future. He said he trusted my judgment more than his own when it came to character under stress, and that if I was reading the letter it likely meant he had ignored that knowledge too long where Celia and Grant were concerned. He admitted Grant had approached him privately the previous autumn with road front concepts, event monetization, and mixed-use dreams. Eleanor said he refused repeatedly, but Celia kept returning with the argument that he was denying her the only inheritance that mattered because she trusted my hands more than her hunger. She wrote that line exactly. Your hands more than her hunger. Then she turned to her daughter. I love Celia, she wrote, but love does not improve a person who keeps mistaking access for worth. If she ever comes to you clean, without grant, without leverage, and without trying to turn Tidewell into a mirror for her own importance, help her if you can. But never give her title to soothe old guilt. I have done enough of that already and it has made neither of us better. The third page named amounts. Eleanor listed every major transfer, rescue, and private advance he had given Celia over 14 years. Tuition. Condo. Wedding. Consulting rescue. Board salary. Market losses he quietly covered. A trust advance he called the final one and underlined twice. The total was staggering. Not because it surprised me. Because he had finally written it plainly enough that no one could later call it neglect. He closed with a sentence that hurt and steadied me. All at once. If they use my death to rush paper, do not negotiate with the ghost of my kindness. I was too slow. You don't have to be. I folded the letter and stood for a long minute in the archive room surrounded by old guest registers and the smell of dust. There are times the dead arrive not as comfort but as permission. Eleanor gave me that in 3 pages. Saturday evening at Tidewell usually began with cocktails on the veranda, then a short welcome in the ballroom, then dinner, dancing, and the annual founder's toast. That year I kept the structure but changed the temperature. No developers. No concept boards. No donation tables. The memorial lilies were gone. In their place we used low bowls of rosemary, garden roses, candles, and the old brass hurricane lamps Eleanor's mother preferred before the inn became fashionable enough to rent imported glass. I wanted the room to look like Tidewell, not like a tribute sold by the square foot. People came. Word had traveled. Some came out of loyalty. Some out of appetite. Some because when scandal brushes old money, even decent people suddenly rediscover their fondness for history. By 7, the ballroom was full. The local station had a discreet camera near the back. The preservation blogger wore a serious dress as if journalism lived in better fabric. Walter stood by the bar with the expression of a man who knew the night might determine which acquaintances he could greet next season without embarrassment. Simon Vale did not appear, but his counsel did. Good. Lawyers make cleaner witnesses than developers when shame enters a room. Celia arrived just before the program began. Alone. She wore black this time, simple and expensive, no pearls, no cream, no illusion of soft triumph. Her face was controlled again, but not convincingly. People moved around her the way guests move around broken crystal on the floor. They knew where not to step. I watched her pause by the sideboard, take in the camera, Benjamin, Lydia, June, and the absence of Grant, and I knew she finally understood that control had become observation. Grant came 5 minutes later through the rear hall. He had changed suits and shaved too quickly, which left one pale line near his jaw. He scanned the room, counted the press, saw Benjamin, saw the donors, saw the camera, and actually stopped in the doorway. That was the first honest physical reaction I ever saw from him. Not anger. Scale. He finally understood scale. I began exactly on time. Good evening, I said. Thank you for coming back to Tidewell House after a difficult week. Some of you were here on Thursday when my wife's memorial was used to announce a future he did not choose. Tonight is not about that future. Tonight is about him, the house he inherited, the people who kept it standing, and the difference between legacy and appetite. No one coughed. No one scraped a chair. Even the camera operator at the back held still. I said Eleanor recorded a founder's message earlier this year and that, in light of recent events, I believed the room should hear him first. Then I stepped aside and nodded to the projection booth. His face appeared above the ballroom on the old screen exactly as it had in my room the night before. There was a collective softening at first, that little sound people make when the dead seem briefly returned by light. Eleanor welcomed them, joked about miraculous youth, thanked staff, praised the marsh, the roses, the old cedar, the stubbornness of buildings that outlive fashion. Then he shifted. I watched the room realize it in real time. Never trust a person who speaks of legacy while reaching for leverage. Heads turned before the sentence finished. If, after my death, anyone tells you Tidewell should be sold in haste for my sake, they are lying. By then no one in the room was looking at the screen alone. They were looking at Celia. At Grant. At me. At each other. At the portions of themselves that had applauded too quickly on Thursday. If anyone pressures Harold in the name of my wishes, they are speaking for themselves, not me. Celia lowered her eyes. Grant looked like a man calculating whether fire would move faster through dry cedar than ruin through a ballroom full of donors. Then Eleanor gave the line that ended any remaining ambiguity. Celia, if you are in the room for this, I hope you hear what I mean and not what you fear. Several people visibly turned toward her. You could feel the room reassigning sympathy by the inch. When the film ended, silence held for 3 full seconds before anyone moved. Then I stepped back to the center of the floor holding Eleanor's letter. My wife also left a private written instruction, I said. I am going to read only the parts that concern this room and the house we are standing in. I did. Not the whole letter. Only what mattered. His rejection of haste. His warning about Grant's approach months earlier. His explicit statement that Tidewell was not to be used to soothe old guilt or feed new ambition. His list of prior provisions for Celia, not to shame her for accepting help, but to make plain that she had not been ignored, robbed, or denied. And finally, the sentence that sealed the night. If they use my death to rush paper, do not negotiate with the ghost of my kindness. When I finished, I folded the pages carefully and laid them on the lectern. Grant clapped. 3 slow sharp taps of his palms in the stunned room. I will give him this. His instincts for self-destruction were original. Beautiful, he said. Very moving. Conveniently timed too. Benjamin rose half an inch from his chair. I held up one finger. Let him speak. Some men ruin themselves more thoroughly when not interrupted. Grant stepped out into the open floor and smiled at the room with the dead brightness of a man whose loans are already screaming down the line. Eleanor was sentimental, he said. We all know that. God rest him. But sentiment does not change the economics of Tidewell House. This property still bleeds capital, still sits on underutilized frontage, and still requires a future. What you have all witnessed tonight is a skilled reframing by a woman who has always preferred romance to truth. That phrase failed the moment it hit the floor. Too polished. Too rehearsed. Too desperate under the circumstances. He must have heard it himself because he pushed harder. You want to talk about shell vendors, he said. Fine. You want to talk about donor confusion. Fine. But none of you were prepared to save this house until I built a real plan around it. None of you. You like old places. You do not like paying what they cost. Harold has hidden behind staff affection and widowhood for years while the numbers worsened. It would have been smarter if he had stopped there. But panic and ego are a combustible pairing. Then he looked straight at Walter Finn and said, I am the only person in this county who was willing to treat Tidewell like a serious asset instead of a sentimental inn for old women to eat crab cakes in white shoes. That ended the room. Not legally. Socially. The women of Tidewell have kept this house alive longer than any March man ever did alone. Garden clubs. Church committees, widows' luncheons, historical societies, charity dinners, founders, brides, chefs, housekeepers, florists, donors, controllers. Dismiss them in a ballroom and you do not merely lose the room. You lose the story the room tells the next morning. Moira Spence stood again. Mr. Holloway, she said, if you ever speak of women in white shoes like that in my hearing again, you may expect me to finance your enemies on principle. The room broke then, not into chaos, but into alignment. Little murmurs. Chairs adjusting. A man from Savannah laughing once in disbelief. The preservation blogger lowering her phone to get a better angle. Walter setting down his glass. Even the camera at the back leaned closer by instinct. Grant must have felt it because his tone changed from polished to raw. "This place is wasted here," he snapped. "On roses and memory and staff who act like ownership is a feeling. It should have been moved. Optimized. The frontage alone could have carried an entire retail spine. A flagship restaurant. 3 premium leases. Branded cottages. Do you know what all of you are refusing? Do you know what this widower has cost you?" "No," I said. "But I know what you've cost yourself." Benjamin stepped forward then, exactly when needed. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "since you appear determined to keep speaking, perhaps the room should also know that Meridian Harbor accelerated your exposure this morning. Simon Vale's counsel is present tonight regarding misrepresentation, and the Attorney General's Charitable Bureau has received notice of disputed donor solicitations connected to Bellwether Heritage Solutions. If you continue, I recommend you choose each noun carefully." Celia made a sound then. Not a word. A small stunned breath, like someone who has just realized the bridge behind her was never wood but painted paper. Grant turned on her in full view of the room. "You said he would never use the clause," he hissed. She answered louder than he did. "Because I did not know you had lied about half the paper. There are some marriages that reveal themselves entirely in one public exchange. Theirs did." He laughed, ugly and thin. "You knew enough. You wanted the house gone as badly as I did." "Not like this," she said. Ah, there it was. Not innocence. Method. The room heard it too. I could have stopped them then. I did not. Let them speak. Grant said Simon had already advanced concept money. Celia shouted that he told her donors would cover the early costs. He said she had promised widower alignment. She said he had promised the road front alone would buy time. He said she was the one who kept saying her mother owed her. She said he was the one who called the memorial our cleanest window. Window. He had called my wife's memorial their cleanest window. That line did more than all the invoices combined. The camera caught it. The room caught it. Even Celia seemed to catch it only after it left her mouth and ricocheted back with blood on it. I looked at Benjamin. He gave the smallest nod. That was enough. I told the room that no further argument was necessary. Tidewell's future had been secured that morning through lawful conveyance into the Widower and Staff Preservation Trust. Donor revocations would be honored. An independent accounting would be published. Staff would remain. Founders' dinner would proceed. As for any parties who had misused Eleanor's death, his name, or this property, they were no longer speaking for Tidewell in any capacity. Then June, who had been waiting by the side door with the composed patience of a woman who irons tablecloths while dynasties rot around her, opened the door for 2 people in dark suits from the State Attorney General's Charitable Bureau. They did not storm. That would have been vulgar. They entered like auditors, which is far worse for liars. 1 woman. 1 man. Briefcases. Identification. Courteous expressions. The woman introduced herself and said, for the benefit of the room, that they were there to receive original donor materials and preserve records related to the March Legacy Foundation, Bellwether Heritage Solutions, and any solicitations made under Eleanor March's memorial representation. She asked, very gently, whether Mr. Holloway or Ms. March wished to surrender any devices, pledge lists, or foundation records voluntarily before a preservation demand reached broader parties on Monday morning. Grant said he wanted counsel. The man from the bureau said that sounded sensible. Celia looked at me once, just once, as if perhaps there remained some maternal mercy she had forgotten how to ask for correctly. I gave her nothing but truth. The officers did not arrest them. That would have made the scene too neat, and life is rarely that decorative. Instead they requested devices, accepted the donor files Benjamin had already duplicated, and served formal preservation notices. It was, in its way, much more devastating. Arrest can be turned into martyrdom in the right circles. Preservation notices, fraudulent entity names, donor revocations, and counsel requests travel through polite society like sewer gas through a chapel. When the bureau officials finished, I asked Matteo to bring dinner. There is no cruelty quite like feeding a room after the guilty have been named. It tells the innocent that life will continue and tells the guilty that the house no longer revolves around their panic. So dinner was served. Crab soup. Charred trout. Lemon potatoes. Green beans with shallots. Eleanor's silver knife beside the cake. The quartet played again. People did not dance, not much, but they remained. They spoke quietly. They lined up to touch my arm. They told June they were relieved the house would stay itself. They told Lydia they would support the trust. They told Matteo the sticky buns at breakfast had been transcendent, which pleased him more than any donor check ever could. Celia left before dessert. Grant stayed long enough to drink 2 bourbons he did not pay for and leave a phone full of desperate messages vibrating on the linen-lined tray beside his plate. Near the end of the evening, he came to me at the sideboard while the room cut cake around us. "You could still end this smaller," he said. "No," I said. "You made sure of that when you called my wife's funeral your cleanest window." He looked at the ballroom, the donors, the camera at the back, the bureaucrats collecting copies near Benjamin's table, and perhaps for the first time in his adult life recognized a room he could not acquire, flatter, or hurry. Then he said something that almost felt true. "I only ever wanted out." I answered, "Then you should have tried honesty. It is slower, but much cheaper." He laughed once, drained the glass, and walked out into a night that already belonged to consequences. Before the guests left, I gave the final near-end note the way this channel needs it. If you have stayed with me this far, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from so I know who made it through the storm with me. You can also write Tide if this story reminded you that boundaries are not cruelty, they are maintenance. Houses fall when no one respects load-bearing walls. Families do too. After the room emptied, I stood alone in the ballroom while staff cleared plates and the screen cooled above the dance floor. Eleanor's face had vanished back into black, but his voice still felt present in the boards. June came up beside me carrying a stack of folded napkins. "Well," she said. That was a better use of a memorial than what they had planned. I surprised myself by laughing. The sound hurt a little. Grief does that when it is forced to share a night with vindication. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong by one more day. Sunday exposed the difference between a scandal and a collapse. A scandal is noisy. Phones. Speculation. Cars pausing too slowly at the drive. Friends calling under the excuse of concern when what they really want is a front row seat to humiliation. A collapse is quieter. Vendors asking where to send corrected invoices. Donors wanting certified letters. Counsel requesting record holds. Bankers revising tone. Staff checking whether payroll truly remains safe. One is gossip. The other is gravity. Grant did not come back Sunday morning. Celia did. She came to the marsh porch just after church time in a plain navy sweater, no makeup, no jewelry except Miriam's old ring, which surprised me until I learned later it was the only thing Grant had not already used or promised somewhere in his long season of elegant desperation. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in 3 nights, which is what happens when the mirror finally stops collaborating. I was shelling peas with June at the long porch table. The weather had turned mild. The water was high. The house, thank God, was busy in the ordinary way again. Linen carts moving. Ice deliveries. Guests departing. Staff laughing once in the side yard because a life that continues is often the cruelest answer to people who tried to hijack it. Celia asked whether she could sit. I said yes. Then she asked whether Grant had called me. No. He had not called her either, she said. Not since midnight. Meridian Harbor had reached his assistant. Simon Vale's counsel had reached his office. 2 vendors were already demanding immediate settlement. One private lender had called her directly because Grant apparently used her name as reassurance in more rooms than she knew. She said it all flatly, like a woman reciting whether she finally accepted was not personal. Then she set Miriam's ring on the porch table between the peas and June's bowl. He wanted me to sell this first, she said. June kept shelling peas. Smart woman. Some scenes belong to blood whether blood deserves them or not. I looked at the ring. Miriam's ring was white gold with a small square sapphire and 2 chipped diamonds, lovely not because it was grand but because it carried use. Eleanor had once told me Miriam wore it while kneading bread and planting bulbs and grading church raffle lists with the same hand. It was one of the very few things Celia kept from her mother without ever turning it into theater. I asked what she wanted from me. The truth, she said. Not the room truth. The one you would tell if there were no staff, no donors, no lawyers, no cameras, and no one left to impress. So I gave it. I told her I believed she loved her mother, but not enough to stop using his guilt when it suited her. I told her I believed she had spent half her life mistaking being denied title for being denied love. I told her that Grant saw that wound from the first dinner and built his whole ladder on it. I told her she was not innocent, not trapped, not helpless, and not the sole author either. She was something more common and less flattering. A willing partner who kept redefining the line only after it had already been crossed. She did not cry. She asked whether I had ever loved her. I said yes, in all the practical ways that matter more than sentimental speeches, which unfortunately are the least visible forms of love to children who want inheritance to sound like destiny. I fed you, I said. Drove you. Paid bills. Protected your mother's china. Kept your room. Answered midnight calls. Let your mother rescue you with dignity when I thought rescue might still help. If that never felt like love to you because it did not come wrapped in title, I do not know how to repair that now. She touched the ring but did not pick it back up. Then she asked the question she should have asked years earlier. What did he really leave me? I told her the truth there too. Eleanor left her a separate trust years ago. Not Tidewell. Not the land. Liquid assets, municipal bonds, and the little North Carolina marsh cottage Miriam loved as a girl, held free of Grant's reach unless Celia voluntarily pledged it. Benjamin had frozen access the moment donor fraud questions touched the family. Not because Eleanor wanted to punish her. Because Eleanor finally understood that giving Celia direct access during a panic only fed whatever man happened to be standing closest to her hunger. She closed her eyes at that. Then she said something so tired it almost sounded young. He knew me too well. No, I said. He knew himself too late. We sat there in the soft porch light with the peas between us and the tide lifting behind the rail. Finally I pushed Miriam's ring back toward her. Keep that. Sell nothing today. Tomorrow, tell the Bureau the full truth. Tell Meridian Harbor exactly what you signed and what you knew. Tell Simon's counsel when you first realized the title path was false. Do not dress yourself as victim. Do not dress Grant as the only villain. Tell the truth cleanly once in your life and see whether it feels less hollow than performance. She asked whether she could stay on the property. I said no. Not because I wanted theatrical revenge. Because trust, once broken at that scale, makes cohabitation into a form of self-mockery. I gave her 72 hours to clear the owner's suite and the cedar closet in the main hall where she stored more gowns than one body should need. June would oversee the packing. Lydia would inventory anything disputed. The North Carolina cottage, if she behaved honestly with counsel, would be available once the freeze cleared. Tidwell would not. She accepted that more quietly than I expected. On Monday at 11:48, Walter Finn called. Meridian Harbor had accelerated the full bridge exposure. Simon Vale's firm had filed notice of misrepresentation and cost recovery. Bellwether's accounts were locked pending review. One of Grant's Charleston investors had withdrawn support from a separate project. Another lender had frozen his personal line. By noon, the number Walter gave me had climbed past $2 million if everyone pushed at once. And Grant? I asked. Gone to ground, Walter said. Which in this county means some man in loafers is hiding in a hotel he once mocked. He surfaced Tuesday. Not dramatically. No handcuffs on the veranda. No helicopters. Life almost never arranges justice with enough choreography to satisfy the wickedly imaginative. Instead, he was located in a luxury airport hotel outside Jacksonville after using a corporate card already under review to pay for 2 nights and a conference room he apparently thought made him harder to find. It did not. Meridian Council found him first. Then the Charitable Bureau. Then Simon's people. By Friday, his own firm's partners had suspended him. By the following month, 3 civil actions and 1 state fraud inquiry were properly underway. He called me once from a number I did not know. I answered because curiosity is one of my oldest sins. He said my name like it was something he still had a right to shape. Harold. I said nothing. Then he tried for dignity. This did not have to become annihilation. I looked out over the rose path where June and the gardeners were replanting storm-bruised beds with late spring color and finally gave him the line he had earned. You should have thought of annihilation when you turned a memorial into a window. Then I hung up. The legal pieces took months, as legal pieces do. Donor funds were traced, some recovered, some written off, all accounted for. Portia Vane, practical to the core, provided an affidavit before anyone had to ask twice. Walter spent half a season repairing his reputation by financing 2 local preservation projects on unusually generous terms. Simon Vale's firm settled their claim against Meridian Harbor and moved on to prey on someone else's waterfront delusion. Grant eventually entered a civil consent judgment so expensive it will likely follow him into whatever tired version of reinvention men like him attempt in new cities. The state inquiry did not end with a dramatic prison sentence in time for my emotional convenience. It ended the way serious money misconduct often does: records, interviews, frozen entities, negotiated pain, public findings, and the slow removal of trust from a man's future. Sometimes that is the harsher sentence. Celia told the truth. Not beautifully. Not all at once. But enough. She admitted what she knew, when she knew it, what she wanted, and how long she let herself believe the inn could be converted into a permission slip for a different life. Because she cooperated, because the shell structures were Grant's, and because the law reserves special creativity for the person who builds the machine rather than the person who climbs onto it willingly, she avoided the deepest legal exposure. She did not avoid consequence. Word travels. The women who once invited her to charity luncheons stopped calling. The board positions vanished. The little society dinners that had treated her like emerging heritage royalty developed sudden capacity issues. She took the North Carolina marsh cottage when the freeze lifted, sold the SUV Grant once said made her look inevitable, and, last I heard, took a real job with a coastal museum in Wilmington where the donors care more about catalog accuracy than last names. I hope the work does her good. I mean that more than she would believe. As for Tidwell House, the widower and staff preservation trust held. June took over household operations with the kind of authority that only looks quiet if you have never watched a woman run 30 rooms during wedding season. Lydia came back 2 days a week and bullied the books into a standard that would make an angel afraid to expense aspirin. Mateo added Eleanor's sticky buns permanently to Sunday breakfast and called them leverage buns, which I pretended to hate and secretly loved. We turned the road front packing shed into something Grant would despise on principle. A resilience hall. Not a memorial museum. Not a retail spine. A working space for community grief dinners, late-life financial safety workshops, and retreat weekends for women rebuilding after betrayal, widowhood, and other private demolitions. We named the small library inside for Miriam, because some forms of justice do not require erasure, only proper placement. We named the accounting office for Eleanor, because the dead who arrive too late still deserve to fund the future if they finally tell the truth. The first Founders Saturday after the scandal, we filled the ballroom again. Not with prospectus boards. With long tables, local flowers, actual music, and a room full of people who came because the house had survived greed without becoming bitter. I played Eleanor's film once more, not the whole thing, just the section about legacy and leverage. Then I turned it off before his voice could become shrine instead of instruction. Tonight, I said to the room, Tidewell remains what it always was. A place where people bring joy, grief, weather, hunger, vanity, memory, and hope, and leave a little steadier than they arrived. That is enough legacy for one house. Later, after the guests were gone and the staff were stacking chairs, I stood alone on the marsh porch with a glass of bourbon I did not pour down any sink. The water was black silver. The wind smelled of salt and wet grass. Somewhere in the kitchen Mateo was scolding someone for putting hot pans on a polished surface. June laughed once. Lydia argued with a spreadsheet in language not fit for church. And I thought about what age actually gives a woman if she survives herself long enough to claim it. Not softness. Not automatic wisdom. Not sainthood. What it gives, if she is lucky and if life has not frightened all the nerve out of her, is pattern recognition. The ability to see appetite before it changes clothes. The nerve to ask for the paper. The refusal to call disrespect confusion just because the disrespect arrived through blood. I lost my wife. I did not lose my mind, my house, or the right to name theft when it sat down at my table in cream silk and asked for coffee. That is what I want left behind from this story. Not that I won. Though I did. Not that Celia and Grant lost. Though they did. What matters is simpler and harder. When family begins speaking of your dignity as if it were negotiable, believe what you are hearing the first time. When someone wants speed more than transparency, stop the music. When grief enters a room, lock the silver early. And never, ever negotiate with the ghost of kindness someone else is using to sell the ground from under your feet.